Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Expert program. We are excited to have Dr. Jacek Lebecki here to discuss the historical background and current developments with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Please allow me to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Lebecki is a professor of political science and international studies at Georgia Southern University. He is an expert in Polish and European military history. He recently co-wrote and published the book, Defending Eastern Europe, the Defense Policies of New NATO and EU Member States. Please welcome Dr. Jacek Lebecki.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you all who are joining this program right now. I'm going to present by showing you a brief PowerPoint. When you talk about Ukraine and you talk about Ukraine being separate from Russia or being a part of Russia, historians and Putin himself often go back 1,000 years. And 1,000 years ago, there used to be an entity called the Kievan Rus. It wasn't Russia, it wasn't Ukraine, it was a proto-state and a civilization that gave rise to both modern Russia and modern Ukraine. The capital of Kievan Rus was Kiev, the capital of Ukraine today. The important thing about that state was it was an early medieval state. It accepted Christianity from the Byzantine Empire, so it became what we know today as Orthodox Eastern Church. It's not Catholic. And it was Slavic speaking, even though at the origins of Kievan Rus are probably Swedish Vikings who originally put shape to that state. So by the way, that state, as you can see on the map, encompasses what's today's, or at least parts of what's today Ukraine and parts of what's today's Russia. President Putin wrote an article about the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine, and he harkens back to that moment of history that was 1,000 years ago, when it was indeed one civilization. But let's remember that was 1,000 years ago and many things happened in between. One of the things that happened in between was that Kievan Rus was destroyed in the 13th century by the Mongol conquest. And then what's today's Russia and what's today's Ukraine went their separate ways. Most importantly, pretty much all of the territory of what today is Ukraine was taken over by a different entity called the Polish Commonwealth. And we see the Polish Commonwealth on this map. Not today's Poland, was not today's Ukraine, was not today's Belarus, was not today's Baltic countries, was this gigantic empire that encompassed all of those and was linked together by essentially common political fate. So this is the moment when the fate of Ukraine and Russia started diverging, because in the territories occupied by Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a different culture, different language, and even different religions started emerging, specifically in parts of what's today Ukraine. The Orthodox Church made a union with Catholic Church and created what's called today a Uniate Church. That church is very much alive today. It dominates western part of Ukraine. It's essentially a national church of Ukrainians and represents, again, a branch of Christian Orthodoxy that rejoined Catholicism. So a distinct culture, distinct religion, and also distinct politics. For a while, the area of today's Ukraine was controlled by Ukrainian Cossacks who created their own state. And you see the founder of that state, Hetman Khmelnytsky, and the coat of arms of the Ukrainian Cossack state, and even a small map that shows the extent of the Ukrainian Cossack state, which again was not modern Ukraine, but perhaps an ancestors of today's Ukraine. So by the way, that's 17th and 18th century. By 18th century, Russian imperial expansion encompassed most of today's Ukraine, but not all of it. What you see on this map in front of you right now is borders of today's Ukraine marked in black. All of the colored areas are end of 18th century. But you can see that there's a part of today's Ukraine which is under Austro-Hungarian Empire. And by the way, that part of Ukraine was never ruled by Russia in history. In 1939, it was taken over by the Soviet Union, which is to be distinguished from historical Russia. But this is where Ukrainian national language, religion, consciousness developed freely outside of Russian influence. And again, against this notion of historical unity between Russians and Ukrainians, they are distinct people. So fast forward to the 20th century, and when the Russian Empire broke down in 1917 as the result of the Russian revolutions of March and November 1917, Ukrainian nationalists stood ready to proclaim their own country. And what you see on the map is the extent of the territory they're claimed. So who are Ukrainian nationalists? Ukrainian nationalists were a modern phenomenon. There were people who claimed that all Ukrainians, people who inhabit the area that you see on the map, the majority of people inhabiting this area, are one people, speak one language called Ukrainian, to be distinguished from Polish and Russian or Belarusian. And those people, like every modern nation, aspired and should aspire to have its own nation states in the borders that you can see here on the map. Those people, Ukrainian nationalists, failed in their attempt to create a modern Ukrainian state. It was destroyed, defeated on the battlefield by white Russians and red Russians from the east and south, and then Poles from the west. So there was no modern Ukrainian state created at the time, but the national aspiration of Ukrainian people was visible. And then fast forward to the Soviet times. Modern Ukraine never emerged in the most of the 20th century, but the Soviet Union took the territory of what today is Ukraine. And you can see the area of Soviet Ukraine here. You can see that the area of Soviet Ukraine was created from the area of Ukraine that was controlled by the Soviet Union prior to World War II. That's the area in green. Then there was the area of modern Ukraine that was controlled by Poland prior to World War II. That's the area in yellow. And then finally, 1954, so way after World War II, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev attached Crimea to Soviet Ukraine. And Crimea was a region that historically never really belonged to Ukraine. It was inhabited by Tatars and then conquered by Russia in the 18th century, inhabited by Russians. But given that in some sense, those borders between Soviet republics had no meanings, Nikita Khrushchev, whose origins were actually Ukrainian, decided that giving Crimea to Ukraine, which was an nominally autonomous republic of the Soviet Union, made sense. So this is how Soviet Ukraine emerged. So what was Soviet Ukraine? So Soviet Union was a communist country. Communism obviously wanted to abolish capitalism. Communism also had a complex relationship with the question of nationality. Marxist-Leninists recognized the idea that different people have different languages, different cultures, and those languages and cultures require some consideration. The notion was that if languages and cultures of separate nationalities are allowed to flourish, to have their own language rights and cultural rights, eventually any antagonism between nations will disappear. And most importantly, if capitalism is abolished, any deep sources of any human antagonism will be abolished. So the Soviet Union took the form of this federative republic that included 15 different separate entities called Soviet Socialist republics, and all of them were somehow supposed to embody national aspirations of different constituent larger nations of the Soviet Union. So Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was just one of them, the second largest after Russia. Obviously, in practice, the national rights of Ukrainians were not that, most importantly, that that major way respected. But nevertheless, there was some embodiment of Ukrainian in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets were so confident in the stability of their country that, at least nominally, in the Soviet constitution, each of those constituent republics were given a right to secession. Here comes 1990, 1991, Union breaks apart, and lo and unexpectedly, every one of the republics claims the right to secession and secedes from the Soviet Ukraine, emerges as an independent country, and the territorially second largest country in Europe after Russia itself. Some 40 million people, a large country, potentially powerful. That's it emerged from the ruins of communism, and for the first in modern times of the Ukraine was constituted historically, even though it claimed to be the country of Ukrainian people. In practice, only some 50% of people spoke Ukrainian at home. There were many people who claimed to be Ukrainian but spoke Russian as their native and original language. By the way, that includes the current president of Ukraine, Zelinski, whose first language is Russian and who grew up in a Ukrainian Jewish family. You can see on the map that farther east you went in modern Ukraine, more Russian speakers you had. Ukraine emerged as an independent country, as a democracy, which means you had free elections and free speech, political freedom. In practice, it meant that Western Ukraine, which was more pro-Western and pro-Ukrainian nationalist, and Eastern Ukraine, which was more pro-Russian and Russian-speaking, constantly competed in elections. And the power went back and forth between political factions controlled by the eastern and western part of the country. By the way, the country was also fairly poor, corrupt. The promises of independence, like it often happens in cases like this, and often happened after the fall of communism, did not necessarily work out for the people of Ukraine. Most importantly, Russia had dramatic influence on independent Ukraine. It could use the Russian speakers in Ukraine, who very often had pro-Russian sentiments, especially in Crimea. Russia was a much larger and powerful country, and pro-Russian presidents would often win Ukrainian elections. In other words, Russia had dramatic level of influence on Ukraine, and Russia generally claimed to exercise power over all of the neighboring countries, especially where Russian minorities lived. And on the other hand, NATO expanded in Europe. You can see the map of NATO expansion. The biggest benefit from Russian point of view and Ukrainian point of view was NATO. So that came close to the borders of Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, did not necessarily want to join NATO because there was no consensus domestically in Ukraine, given the fact that power kind of went back and forth between Eastern and Western Ukraine. But Russia increasingly was seeing that expansion of NATO as some form of Western aggression. What Russia also saw as Western aggressions is domestic revolutions in countries like Ukraine, 2004, Georgia, 2003, Yugoslavia, 2000, even Kyrgyzstan and Lebanon. Those democratic revolutions were perceived as challenges to Putin because Putin ran an autocratic government, and for Putin, the partners were American presidents. I think it's important to mention that in 2014, a pro-Russian president was overthrown in Ukraine and replaced by a pro-Western president. That made Putin really unhappy, and he reacted by stimulating anti-Ukrainian separatism in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. As a result, Crimea was taken over by Russia, and two independent pro-Russian republics were proclaimed in Eastern Ukraine, the Luhansk and the Donetsk republics. That's 2014. The president at the time was President Obama. He reacted with sanctions, but no decisive military moves against Russia. Then President Trump came to power, who was obviously much more pro-Russian and friendly to Putin. And Putin was hoping to negotiate some type of deal with Ukraine and the United States, whereby Ukraine would give up those territories that were taken over by Russia. That didn't happen. President Trump was pretty much alone with his policy towards Russia. Neither Democrats nor congressional Republicans supported him. Then President Biden comes to power, much more hostile towards Russia. And at that moment, President Putin decided on outright military invasion of Ukraine, hoping to build on his earlier gains in 2014 and to reestablish, as clearly we could see from the direction of attack, reestablish total control over Kiev and Ukraine, like it used to be, because in some sense Russia controlled at least large part of Ukrainian politics in 1990s and early 2000s. And to the surprise of everybody, Ukrainians put up stout resistance and beat back the Russian attempts to take the capital of Ukraine. And right now, the fight in Ukraine is mostly in eastern part of the country that Russia is trying to take over. And obviously, United States and countries like Poland supported Ukraine dramatically. A little bit more about Ukrainian president and Ukraine today. So Ukrainian President Zelinski you perhaps know, former comedian, a person who became popular by playing president on TV. And he's of Jewish background. His first language is Russian, not Ukrainian. When he was elected president, number one, it was with overwhelming support of Ukrainian people, 74% elected him. He was perceived mostly as a president friendly to Russia and wanting reconciliation and peace with Russia. Nationalistic Ukrainians voted for the previous president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. You can see support for him on the map in western part of Ukraine. And then pro-Russian Ukrainians voted for Yuri Boyko, and you can see support for him in the eastern part of Ukraine. But Zelensky was the candidate of the middle. So by no means somebody perceived or elected as anti-Russian. So President Putin today makes claims that Ukraine was taken over by the Nazis and that Ukraine wanted to have a war with Russia, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories involving Ukrainian weapons labs and so on and so forth, and nothing of it is remotely close to the facts of the case. But I'm going to stop at this point, I hope, for questions.
Okay. So one of the questions is, what are, now that we're 3 months into this invasion, what is the rest of Europe, what are they wanting to accomplish, or how are they wanting to get involved or kind of keep their distance?
So clearly European countries divided into countries very strongly supporting Ukraine and countries that are much more on the fence about the issue. So number one, countries that very strongly support Ukraine are the Baltic countries, Poland, and Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden. And perhaps Romania can be added to the list. Those are the countries most directly threatened by Russia and potential Russian aggression. So they want absolute support, unified European and NATO support for Ukraine, and those countries themselves transfer large amounts of weapons to Ukraine. By the way, in that group of countries is probably the United States also, in some sense. But if we limit ourselves to just Europe, I would say those are the countries. Then you have countries more reluctant to support Ukraine and much more willing to engineer some type of compromise diplomatic solution. And I would say France and England belongs to those countries. Both of them have large amounts of economic interest in connection with Russia. For Germany, it's energy exports, but also exports of industrial goods to Russia. Actually, out of European countries, France had the largest amount of investment in Russia. So they stand the most to lose from any type of destruction of Russia as the result of the crisis. And then you have countries in between that have much more complicated relationship with Russia. One interesting case in this respect is England. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, came really strongly in support of Russia, and in some sense to detriment of British financial interests, because famously Russian oligarchs and Russian banks invested heavily in London. It was, their playground. They were more present in London than in any other European capital. So Great Britain actually stands to lose from this very strong support for Ukraine, but Boris Johnson did it nevertheless. You have very strongly pro-Russian countries such as Hungary, possibly Serbia, countries in which the relationship with Russia is very much a matter of domestic contestation. Perhaps Italy is in that group. So there's far from unified European reaction, but at least nominally, Europe seems to be united in imposing sanctions against Russia and helping Ukraine. Behind that unity, there's lots of different factions and sides to that relationship.
Okay, thank you. So you have a question from a former student of yours. He wants to know, what is your opinion on having a Ukraine be a neutral state to form a physical barrier between Russia and the West? And so is it too late for this?
It's a very good question and clearly reflects a good thinking on the part of the question asker. Thank you. Ukraine itself, in some sense, proclaimed itself to be a neutral country upon independence. Ukraine was a country that did not join any military alliances after 1991. And in many ways, the country balanced between Russia and the West. Ukrainian presidents tried to maintain a good relationship with both sides by playing the card of the Ukrainian national interest that required a balance between both sides. Then the president of Ukraine, Zelinski, invoked this option of Ukrainian neutrality after Russians invaded. When Russian tanks were just about to enter Kiev and it seemed that Ukraine might even fall, Ukrainian president was very strongly talking about the fact that any type of compromise and ceasing ending the war, among others, would involve some form of Ukrainian neutrality. The problem with this option is what would guarantee Ukrainian security under the option of neutrality. So de facto, it would have to involve some form of guarantees from countries that cannot be just Russia, because Russia cannot be trusted to guarantee Ukrainian neutrality, and some type of guarantee of Ukrainian security that can be enforced. And the problem is the following: there was such a guarantee given a long time ago. In 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. By the way, that was largely enforced and required by the United States. There was a multilateral agreement signed by the United States, Russia, also England and France, I believe, whereby Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States, France, and England. So that's known as Budapest Protocol. By the way, there is some ambiguity about the legal meaning of the document. Nevertheless, it was signed. So Ukraine already had security guarantees. That proved to be hollow. So what is to guarantee Ukrainian security? It remains an open question, and it might be indeed too late to negotiate Ukrainian security. It's significant that it was a preferred option of Ukrainians themselves and was evoked by Ukrainians themselves in the early part of the war. Right now, there's kind of, I think people are waiting for the outcome of the armed conflict, which seems to be going, well, God knows, it's gods of war that are deciding. But generally, the Russian ambitions are much lesser at this point. Russians seem to be fighting for a tiny portion of Ukraine in the eastern part. The whole dream of subjugating Ukraine is over. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. So another question that came in is, what is the difference between the war Russia and Ukraine is having now and the one in 2014? Why the attention from the Western media now?
So number one, there was very much attention of Western media in 2014. People who remember that Russian takeover of Crimea and then the revolt in Donbass was very much on the minds of Western policymakers and so on and so forth. It wasn't as much as today because the scale was much different. And the big difference is that 2014 in many ways was a covert war, in a sense that throughout the whole process, Russia tried to hide the fact that it's even a war at all. Even the takeover of Crimea was hidden under the notion that unknown little green men took over Crimea, and Putin pretended like those people don't exist and they are not Russian, and then pretended that people of Crimea themselves detached Crimea from Ukraine and decided to attach it to Russia. In Eastern Ukraine, there was a total denial. The notion was that there are no Russian soldiers whatsoever, that Russia didn't do anything. It was just local Russian people that spontaneously revolted against Ukraine and established independent states. So the scale and the openness of what happened in 2022 is completely different. It was an outright, massive Russian military invasion that, by the way, Putin still refuses to call war, but he's in the company of all the modern Western politicians who refuse to call wars what we fight as wars. So nothing new about that. So kind of open warfare, Russian hand is not hidden, a massive conventional invasion. Nothing in 2014 even approximated that. It was irregular warfare, covert operation, what people sometimes called hybrid warfare, which, by the way, is a Western term that the Russians didn't use. And that's very different than open warfare. What's happening today is much more comparable to, let's say, US invasion of Iraq in 2003, right? That, we never hide the fact there was an outright invasion intended to take over the entire country and change the regime. The term used was de-Baathify Iraq, so just like for Putin, the term is to denazify Ukraine.
Thank you. So another question is, what does Putin have to gain from the invasion? Does he want to take the whole country over or just part of it?
So it's a very good question. Clearly, at the beginning of the invasion, the ambition was to take over the entire country. And again, for Russia, in many ways, that simply meant reestablishing the status quo that in some sense Russia enjoyed prior to 2014, even though Ukraine was a nominally independent country. Russia had a huge amount of influence in the entire country, and Ukraine was ruled by a pro-Russian president, Yanukovych. So with the overthrow of that president, Russia lost control of Ukraine that in many ways Russia had. In 2014, Putin's reaction was to take over parts of Ukraine, but he lost the rest of it to pro-Western Ukrainians. So by 2022, the notion was that Ukraine will be invaded, Ukrainian government will fall easily, and Ukraine will be again controlled by a government friendly to Russia. Whether parts of Ukraine would be detached from Ukraine and given to Russia, that was an open question. That invasion failed. So the move against Kiev, the fast invasion of Ukraine that clearly intended at the beginning to take over Kiev, replace Zelinski government, replace it with a pro-Russian government that failed militarily. So right now, it looks like the idea is to detach parts of Eastern Ukraine from Ukraine. The Luhansk and the Donetsk Oblast, Russians control parts of it, not all of it, most importantly, and then establishing a land bridge from Donetsk and Luhansk to Crimea. And by the way, Russians accomplished that. They took Mariupol, which was kind of the last port standing in the way. And that was very important also to create a land bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia. By the way, if Russians win it, that in some sense would satisfy at least some of the Russian territorial ambitions. And Russians today in the war control large part of what they want to win. So the struggle is for the last remnants of Ukrainian resistance in the Luhansk and Donbas regions. And by the way, that's very much hinging on the face of war right now.
Okay. There's another question. Was Moldova ever part of USSR and therefore would be endangered by Russian invasion?
So very much Moldova, the very creation of Moldova, by the way, historical name is Bessarabia, was the very name Moldova precisely exists because it was a part of USSR and early it was a part of Russia. So historically, actually, well, here we go. Historically, it's mostly part of today what we call Romania, and then it was Romanian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia. Russia took it in 1812 as a result of war with the Ottomans. Then the Russian Empire fell in 1917 and Bessarabia was taken over by Romania, and most of inhabitants of Moldavia or Bessarabia are Romanian speakers. So that was part of Romania during the interwar period. Then in 1939 or 1940, the Soviet Union took it back from Romania as part of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Then Romania regained it as they were allies of the Nazi Germany in World War II, so they regained Bessarabia, and then Soviet Union under Stalin took it back again and created what's called the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. So again, the autonomous area for Romanian speakers. Then with the fall of the Soviet Union, Moldavia became independent, but part of Moldavia where Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian speakers dominated, seceded from the rest of Moldavia and proclaimed itself a separate republic. And that's in 1992. And that frozen conflict persisted to this day. So the notion is that if Putin is to win the war in Ukraine, he would also take over all of Moldavia, or at least attach the autonomous area of the Russians, which is called Transnistria, attach it to Russia. So that really, by the way, rankled Romania, which is right there on the border. And that's one of the reasons why Romania is one of the most anti-Russian countries in this whole coalition lineup of European powers. Romanians are really supporting Ukrainians because they worry about their ethnic brothers in Moldova. And Moldavia is a very troubled country. So the fate of Moldavia is very much in the balance.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is maybe 2 or 3 parts. So I'll go through it all first. What benefit or benefits do Russian-speaking people who are in Eastern and Southern Ukraine actually have by wanting more of a Russian-oriented allegiance? Excuse me.
It's a very good question. So, a couple of truths about Ukraine and those Eastern areas. As I said earlier, Ukraine emerged as an independent country, as a very troubled country. So the hopes of independence were largely not fulfilled. Ukraine was democratic, has been democratic, but declining economy, corruption, oligarchic rule, a decline of heavy industry. Ukraine, for most of post-independence period, has not been a happy country, and Ukrainians have not been a happy people. For Eastern Ukrainians who are Russian speakers or consider themselves Russian, that reality meant that perhaps they either should be autonomous or even secede from Ukraine attached themselves to Russia. And they largely saw Russia as a more successful country, including under Putin. And in some sense, Russia was a more successful country under Putin, especially starting in early 2000s, when Russian economy started rebuilding under Putin and Russia saw a modicum of stability and wealth, even though it was very unequally distributed and so on and so forth. So we can understand the feelings of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine. But the second part of the question is, so that was the hope, was the feeling, what was it fulfilled? So in 2014, Luhansk and Donetsk seceded from Ukraine, they established independent republic, and then Crimea seceded from Ukraine and was formally attached to Russia. And the answer is probably no. Just precisely when those areas went to Russia expecting a better fate, and by the way, fairly rationally expecting that no matter what Russia is, it's in better economic shape than Ukraine. Just at that point, Russia itself started declining. So part of it is Western sanctions that were imposed on Russia. But most importantly, the Putin's model of modernization and prosperity for Russia itself started failing. Donetsk and Luhansk, those independent republics, today are crime-driven militaristic disasters, where, if anything, Russian speakers probably suffer worse economic fate than they suffered, no matter how bad, under Ukrainian independence. The people who took power in those republics were militaristic thugs, criminals. By the way, I invite anybody to read the history of those independent republics, where the leaders get assassinated serially by each other, or apparently by agents sent by Moscow that serially disposes of those militia leaders if they don't seem to fulfill Russian bidding. And Crimea might be nationalistic Russian, but detached from Ukraine and the mainland, it's in dire economic straits. So the fate of better life, the hope of better life was largely not fulfilled when those areas become independent. And by the way, Ukrainians today, or Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine today, look at what happened in Luhansk and Donetsk. And unlike in 2014, when Russia invaded 2022, there was much less enthusiasm for Russian rule, because in some sense, Russia itself proved to be a hollow promise.
Thank you. So culturally speaking, how different is Ukraine with Russia?
So Ukrainian language is different from Russian. All Slavic languages are similar. So that's number one. Polish is similar to Russian. Ukrainian is similar to Polish and Russian. For a Polish speaker like myself, what I hear when I hear Ukrainian is a lot of Polish words, much more Polish words than Russian words, but then some Russian words and some words that are neither Russian or Polish, but are Ukrainian. We can understand each other though. So Ukraine has a separate language, separate national literature, a script which is Cyrillic, but differs from Russian Cyrillic. For instance, they write the letter E distinctly, so it's very easy to tell whether the text is Ukrainian or Russian. Ukrainians have a separate national history and separate sense of identity, and especially in Western Ukraine, it's very solidly based, because Western Ukraine was actually never ruled by Russia, ever. It was ruled by the Soviet Union between 1939 and 1991, but never by Russia. So they have their own tradition, religion, culture, and so on and so forth. As you travel east in Ukraine, it all becomes shaded, and Eastern Ukrainians are very often, again, Russian or Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And by the way, Zelinski is an example of a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. His first language by far is Russian. Most of his movie career was in Russian. Ukrainian is a second language to him. He had to learn it right now when he speaks it, which is kind of interesting. So the culture's shade, I can tell you that when I visited Ukraine, one of the best watched TV in Ukraine was Russian TV. Again, the popular culture very often comes from Russia. There's tremendous affinity between between Russians and Ukrainians culturally. No, politically, there is this notion that Ukrainians are freedom-loving Cossacks, and at least in Ukrainian stereotypes, Russians are enslaved peasants, and with imperial ambitions and so on and so forth. So if we talk about stereotypes, that's what we see. Probably both sides, as it comes to negative stereotypes, can see each other as backward. In Russian popular mind, Ukrainians today are probably enslaved by the West and enamored with Western promises of freedom and prosperity. And in Ukrainian popular mind, Russians are enslaved people, completely stupefied by Putin's propaganda and believing themselves to be bringers of better civilization and better order to the world that doesn't want them. So you have this clash of perspectives of otherwise very similar people. But come on, American history is all about very similar people who spoke the same language becoming enemies, and that's the British and the Americans, right? Between whom there was very little cultural difference, and nevertheless, very bloody War of Independence resulted. And then we had the Civil War, which was a failed attempt at Southern nationalism. So nothing here is unknown to us.
Okay, great, thank you. So our next question is, what do you think of Henry Kissinger's assertion that Ukraine needs to give up territory to Russia and end the war?
So Henry Kissinger is so old, and nothing against old people, and so much a child of the Cold War. So his glory was diplomatic negotiations with the Soviet Union in the 70s, with the Vietnamese in the 70s, with the Chinese in the 70s, great powers talking to great powers. So being this, old diplomat, child of realism, he thinks in terms of concessions, he thinks in terms of first spheres of influence. It's a little bit like the 19th century great statesmen that traded pieces of territory in Europe to establish peace. That's how he imagines himself. By the way, Henry Kissinger, a great historical hero, is Count Metternich of Austria, who presided over the Congress of Vienna and established peace in Europe after Napoleonic Wars by carefully giving pieces of territory here and there and managing the relationship of great powers by moving people and territory back and forth. So he imagines somehow that this is still those times, right? And he believes so, he's a realist. And he thinks that by trading territory and carefully balancing claims of different countries, peace can be created. So, his rightness or wrongness stands on kind of rightness of his vision. Is realism still valid? And I think he undercounts the passions and the feelings of nationalism and public opinion that makes this type of elite diplomacy that he practiced and used to be practiced in the 19th century outdated. Theoretically, it must be the best idea to give, let's say, Crimea to Russia. By the way, it might well be. But would Ukrainian public opinion stand for it? By the way, would Russian public opinion stand for, gaining out of this whole war much less than was expected? So he kind of wants to ban those passions from the sphere of politics and live in the sphere of elite negotiations where only the leaders trade people and territory and therefore lasting peace can be negotiated. So by the way, I guess with all due respect to Henry Kissinger, I think at this point in the war where the outcome of the armed conflict is undecided, people saw his comments negatively. No, only last month when Russians were much deeper into Ukraine, it seemed like President Zelinski of Ukraine was willing to to talk about some type of territorial adjustment, provided, here we go, he said, it's approved by Ukrainian people. But he mentioned neutrality for Ukraine. He mentioned, Zelinski did, he mentioned concessions to Russia, provided they are approved by Ukrainian people. Right now, he's not talking about it because Ukraine is doing much better militarily. So I think Kissinger's comments came in kind of this wrong moment, and only a month ago, his comments would have been seen as much less controversial.
Okay. So what is your opinion on Russia joining NATO?
So I think that idea was around like forever. I think so. I can see the question. It wasn't just Putin that mentioned it. It was Yeltsin who did in like 1991, 1992. It was kind of obvious. Russia is democratic now and wants to be at peace with the West. Why don't we join NATO and solve all the problems? So in 1992, when Yeltsin mentioned those ideas, that was kind of, nobody wanted to expand NATO at all, and there was talk about abolishing NATO altogether. So that kind of struck people as outlandish. Then NATO started expanding, but Russia opposed it. At the same time, what was created, that's President Clinton, was a form of accommodating Russia within the structures of NATO. So what was created is Russia-NATO Council and a structure for, institutional structure for some type of security dialogue between NATO and Russia. So there were all kinds of attempts, not so much to include Russia in NATO, but kind of accommodate Russian concerns. I'm not sure when Putin, and if he ever mentioned Russian membership in NATO. And I'm not sure where the idea, frankly, is. So let's take it seriously. So one of the strictures of NATO is that NATO members have to be democratic countries with strongly established democratic control of the military by civilian government. By the way, does Turkey fulfill it? Probably not. Well, it does because it's a civilian government. I'm just digressing right now. Russia probably cannot become a member of NATO because of its domestic political order. How would China react to Russia joining NATO? Would it be seen as anti-Chinese? Is Putin serious about Russia joining NATO? Russia established its own Eurasian Security Organization, the Shanghai Treaty Organization. And then there's also an organization for some of the former Soviet countries, a security alliance. Kind of open question. Again, it's not a new idea. President Yeltsin was already talking about it in the early 1990s. No, by the way, if Putin mentioned it early in his presidency, sure. And let's remember that Putin was perceived very differently in the early part of his presidency. Many people saw him as a westernizing reformer, and some of the things that he did for Russia were very useful and beneficial for Russia. By the way, Putin still very much had an option of pursuing a peaceful path of development for Russia, building up Russian economy, not the military. And for instance, asserting influence in Ukraine peacefully. The option that largely worked for Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s. So in 2014, the choice in response to again, the fall of the pro-Russian president in Ukraine was an aggression and takeover of parts of Ukraine. So that there was a possibility of a different choice, simply waiting for Ukrainian domestic politics to stabilize and reasserting Russian influence peacefully. So I think Putin already made his choices.
Okay. And I think we have time for two
One more
more
question.
questions. So
okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This question is, if Russia takes the rest of the eastern Ukraine, will the remainder of the country of Ukraine be able to continue to exist?
So yeah, if they take their, at this point, assumed goals, which is Donetsk and Luhansk and the land bridge to Crimea and Crimea. So number one, yes, Ukraine would still have very much border with the West. Ukraine will have a large port of Odessa. So yes, in many ways, what Russians would take is devastated former industrial wasteland of Donetsk and Luhansk, in some sense, a liability to Russia. And not an asset to Ukraine, because Donetsk and Luhansk indeed used to be the richest areas of Ukraine, but after how many 8 years of warfare and right now recent destruction, one wonders about how much it's useful for Ukraine to even have it. So number one, yes, but number two, they take over unless there's some type of trade bargain between Ukraine and Russia, would simply result in continuous standoff between Russia and Ukraine. So both countries would become those militarized, hostile countries, and both of them will suffer from the effects of that hostility for ages to come. So economically, neither Russia or Ukraine can gain much from this continuous hostility. And then the Western sanctions will be on. It's very difficult to imagine Russia developing economically in isolation from the West. On the other hand, Ukraine will be hostile to Russia, will be militarized. And again, it's very difficult for a militarized country to develop, even though you have examples to the contrary, like Israel. By the way, Zelinski, that's what Zelinski, being Jewish, among others, evokes. He says, we have to become like Israel. We have to become a militarized country because we have this dramatic security challenge that we have to meet. And that challenge will be with us on the long term. So it's very difficult to be hopeful about, by the way, either Ukraine and or Russia in this post-war future.
And so this is the today is the third month of the invasion. And right, exactly 3 months ago it started. What are your predictions moving forward? How long will this last? What will happen in your opinion?
Nothing that one cannot find in open sources. So I'm kind of going to repeat what seems to be emerging as a consensus, which is Russians are still advancing and might still gain some Ukrainian territory. They might even reach the boundaries of what they want to have as a conquest and even try to negotiate. At this point, Ukrainians will not negotiate and will launch their counterattack. They won't. At this point, Ukrainians seem to be gaining, are on the verge of military superiority. And they will try to retake what Russians took. So the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasti, but also Kherson, also Mariupol, and perhaps even Crimea. And only, so several scenarios then, Ukrainians can win outright and put Russia out of the entire pre-2014 territory of Ukraine, which is probably unlikely. Ukrainians can win partial victories. And at that point, the war can reach stalemate, which can continue indefinitely or end up with some type of negotiated peace. Let's say pre-2004, 2014 boundaries, right? So what Russia had prior to the recent invasion, that might stop there. Or Ukrainians might fail in their counteroffensive, right? And then Russians will keep entire Donetsk and Luhansk land bridge to Crimea and Crimea, and Ukrainians might negotiate from that position. Ukrainians are arming, mobilizing, training, and incorporating the newly acquired Western weapons. So the notion is that Ukrainians are still very much on the defensive, and they are actually preparing for a real counteroffensive. That it's yet to happen, and some experts say that would only happen sometime in July or August. right? So there's still a lot of attritional warfare with marginal gains on both sides to happen before the Ukrainians will start the great counteroffensive. That's the idea that time, again, the idea is that time is working in Ukrainian favor because they are being resupplied by the West, whereas the Russians are on the long term already expended lots of what they have, and the Russian capacity to resupply, refurbish, rebuild their military and keep resisting is limited. But who knows? Russia, I guess one saying which I repeat often is Russia is never as weak or as strong as it appears. So in other words, people who bet on Russian weakness, like Hitler, are disappointed. And then people who exaggerate Russian strength, like what happened prior to the invasion recently, are often disappointed. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't exaggerate the prospects for either side in the future. By the way, I mean, nobody was channeled more by Russian invasion of Ukraine than Germans in 1941. Germans were just like Russians recently, were over-optimistic and completely underdid their logistics and failed eventually. And then the recent Russian offensive into Donbass reminds me so much of the Germans at the Battle of Kursk, which is this very deliberate advance in the teeth of the strongest resistance, which is long prepared, tenuous, and with zero benefits of surprise or maneuver, just beating your head against the wall. That's what Russians are doing. So very, very non-smart form of warfare, so to speak. And then just like the Germans in 1941, the initial part of Russian plan was clearly arrogance, the notion that Ukraine would just fold, it would just fall apart, and the Russians can take over Kiev and pick up the pieces. That didn't work out. I think the time is out, Amy.
Yes,
so
there's so much to so many pieces to this puzzle, and we really appreciate you taking out your time and your busy schedule to kind of piece together and let us have a better understanding of what's happening and possible future developments. The whole world is kind of watching and waiting to see, and hopefully other countries, China, won't get involved as well. So,
okay. All right. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm
you.
answering one of the questions.
Yes, I think one more question came in as you were talking.
Yeah, so there was a question, is there any reason for NATO to exist? Actually, I have a very simple answer. NATO exists because its members wanted to exist, right? If the members of NATO didn't want NATO to exist, it wouldn't exist. Warsaw Pact dissolved because the members of Warsaw Pact didn't want Warsaw Pact. So the real question is, why do members of NATO want NATO to exist? Well, clearly they see NATO of benefit. NATO is an alliance of sovereign states. So this is what they want. And, a little bit more sophisticated answer, I think the background of that question is, well, if the Soviet Union dissolved and Warsaw Pact dissolved, why didn't NATO dissolve? Well, because the Soviet Union dissolved, because constituent members of the Soviet Union wanted to dissolve, and Warsaw Pact dissolved because the members wanted to dissolve, and NATO did not because the members didn't want it to dissolve. And then NATO expanded, and here is, I think the most interesting part of the answer. NATO expanded into Eastern Europe not because of Russian threat. When you study the diplomatic history of NATO expansion, actually nobody was fearing Russia in 1990 in Eastern Europe, right? Poland wasn't, Czech Republic wasn't, Hungary wasn't. NATO expanded because those Eastern European members thought it's a good idea to join a secure alliance of Western democracies, given general instability felt by the world at the time. And what they were looking at especially was the wars of Yugoslavian succession, right? The civil wars in Yugoslavia. And it was like, oh my God, we need some type of security institution to guarantee general peace, not against Russia because Russia was weak and threatened nobody, but against this general fear of instability. In other words, it's a myth that NATO expanded to contain Russia, that it's nowhere in the diplomatic history. Now, today, certainly it's against Russia and for a good reason. But, sovereign states do what they want to do. And who is to tell sovereign states what to do? And certainly Poland, Czech Republic, or Hungary joined NATO because there were sovereign states that did what they wanted to do. End of the story.
If you want to know more, you could read Jacek's book here. It is available here at Gwinnett County Public Library, as well as many other bookstores. So this, you can delve in a little bit deeper into it. But we want to thank you again for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us. And